today is I'm a very much a micro level. I teach at Clayton at Clayton High School here in St. Louis. I teach a history of St. Louis class, and so when I heard about this opportunity, about this platform that was out there is by WashU, making this big idea on the internet about urban studies and about a lot of interdisciplinary stuff, it caught my attention. And so I looked at it in that nature. And so Dr. Burke's going to be the one that's going to tell you a lot about that, about the origins and the start of the whole project, and give you a bit of a more specific feel of what that looks like. And then I'll show you some of the sources that I've pulled from it that I think work really well in the classroom or that you'll be able to see. Again, I'm very much a micro level. It's history of St. Louis, but I've tried my best to go broad and think of, U.S. history trends or world history trends in that nature. And then I'm going to give you about 15, 20 or so to actually really interact with the platform and look through it. I found myself doing a lot of the prep work. I started diving into rabbit holes and just, oh my gosh, I didn't even know about that St. Louis. And I teach the whole class on it, and I just kept on going. And so that's kind of the whole point and what I think is really cool about it. And then after, we'll kind of dig ourselves out of that rabbit hole maybe and start to think collectively about what you noticed, what you saw. And I've got a discussion question too for us there. But Dr. Burke, take it away for sure.
Oh, great. Okay. Can everyone hear me? I can't quite tell if I can hear the microphone. Good. Hi, thank you so much for having me and for coming to our presentation. I am a professor at WashU in the music department. I am not a K-12 teacher. My job is much, much easier than your jobs. So I admire what you do. And I also want to defer to your expertise on how or even whether what I'm going to show you today is useful in your own classroom. So I hope that it is. And if there's anything I can do to help make it more useful, I'm glad to. But I will obviously defer to you and to Connor as well on that question. So the divided city, well, I guess I should start and say, what I'm going to be talking about for the next few minutes is an online project that I spent the last academic year working on, called Music and, I think the full title is Music and Segregation in 20th Century St. Louis, Uncovering the Sources. And I will tell you a bit more about that here in a moment. This funny little URL is like what's it called?
Google shortener. It takes out a big URL and shortens to that little thing you can use in the class.
So you can use that. It will take you to just a note, the URL as given in the program I don't think is active anymore. So you can go to this. You can also go to digital.wustl.edu/music and segregation. But this will work just as well. So this is part of a broader initiative called the Divided City, which is a project funded by the Mellon Foundation and sponsored by the Center for the Humanities and the College of Architecture at WashU. And it's been going for a few years now. It concludes in 2018. And it's been funding various kinds of research and public projects on urban segregation, to some extent in St. Louis, but not every project is focused on St. Louis. The call for proposals just said any kind of a project about urban segregation is one that we'll consider. My own online project stems out of my longstanding research focus, which is the connections between popular music, jazz and rock and roll in particular, and people's ideas about race in the 20th century United States. So I'm interested in how music changes people's ideas about race. I'm also interested in how musical institutions can sometimes reinforce racial stereotypes and sometimes can reinforce racial divisions. My work before this project hadn't focused on St. Louis. I wrote a book about jazz in New York City. I've been working on some other places around the country. But I've been living in St. Louis since 2004, so it was starting to seem absurd that I didn't know anything about it. So part of my reasoning in applying for this grant was selfish. I wanted to learn some more about the city that I live in. And of course, St. Louis is also an important place, both musically and politically. So in the introduction to the website, which I'll show you here in a moment, I say, St. Louis, notorious for its history of racial segregation, but also widely celebrated for its vibrant musical heritage, provides a significant test case for questions about the connections between music and segregation in urban life. So in other words, my audience here, I think, is largely people from Missouri and possibly from the St. Louis metro area, even more specifically. But I hope that what I've shown here is using St. Louis as a kind of example, we can learn more about the ways in which music and racial segregation affect one another more generally. So as a historian, I wanted to find out what historical sources were available here. And The grant enabled me to hire 2 undergraduate research assistants, and along with me, we conducted research in 2 places. One is the Special Collections of Washington University, so the WashU Archive. The other was the Archives and Research Center of the Missouri History Museum, which if you are not from around here, you might not know, but the museum itself is in Forest Park, right in the middle of St. Louis. The archive is kind of around the corner on Skinker Boulevard, and is one of the largest, if not perhaps the largest, archive devoted to Missouri history in the state. So we went through these collections and we played a lot of hunches. We looked at what was there. Sometimes we spent weeks looking at things that turned out not to be relevant. Sometimes we kept hitting the jackpot over and over again. And the question that we asked was simply, what connections were there between music and racial segregation in 20th century St. Louis? So a very broad kind of scope. And the project yielded two parts, really. So here's the website. And I guess this is almost legible, but even if you can't quite make out the tiny print here, I'll talk you through it. So one side of this is a database. And what we did was, you can see it says we divided city, and then, ow. I'm good, okay, that was painful. The database is a database of the relevant sources that we found at these 2 institutions. It's an Excel spreadsheet. I could open it up, but I fear that something will somehow crash if I attempt to mess with too many applications at once. So you can trust me on this. It's an Excel spreadsheet. It's got over 500 entries in it, and it's available to anyone who wants to download it. Any of you or anybody else can just click, and it will be downloaded to your laptop. It's intended as a tool for researchers, but it also gives anyone a sense of the variety of materials available. So even if you don't intend to go to the History Museum and kind of follow the leads, you can get a sense of what sorts of sources we found. And we searched the papers of some people and institutions you might expect, so W.C. Handy, the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra, and others that might seem tangential. So we went through the papers of mayors Cervantes and Tucker, 2 mid-20th century mayors of St. Louis. We went through the records of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. We went through the records of something called the Fortnightly Dance Club, which you might be familiar with if you are from this side of Missouri. So by casting a really wide net, we caught a wide range of sources about St. Louis music making in this period. So that's one side of this that might prove useful. I think the one that might be more useful in the classroom is an online exhibit directed at a general audience, which is based around what I thought were 5 of the most interesting stories that our sources introduced me to. This is obviously kind of subjective. I picked the ones that I wanted to follow and learn more about. And what I do is I tell each story on its own page with links to the relevant primary sources that we found, many of which haven't been published anywhere until now. So some of this stuff was sitting in the archive for decades until either me or my research assistants came across it and decided to do something with it. So what I thought I would do is talk very briefly through the first story now, just to give you a sense of what this is like, and then I'll turn things over to Connor. So if you look on the left margin, you can see, you can click on these. They're arranged chronologically. So there's a story about the St. Louis Symphony Society in 1923. There's a story about the Urban League and the Municipal Theater Association, better known as the Muni in Forest Park. And then there's another one about the Municipal Auditorium, which was later called Kiel Auditorium, and now it doesn't exist anymore. Something called the Negro Music Festival at Sportsman's Park. And then finally, a page about the drive to desegregate Washington University itself in 1949. So I thought we would talk about the first one. So if you click on St. Louis Symphony Society, you get to here, and you can see that the very first image you see is a PDF scan. And what this is a scan of what should be a very dry and boring document. It's a page of the minutes of a 1923 meeting of the St. Louis Symphony Society. This is in the collection of the Missouri History Museum. And what it tells us is that an African-American man who's named only as Mr. Burgess in the minutes had complained to the manager because his sister's season tickets to the orchestra had been moved to the last row of the theater. And the manager, who is the one narrating to the committee, tells them that, in fact, white patrons of the orchestra had complained during the previous season when they were seated next to African-American patrons. And Mr. Burgess correctly surmised that his seat change had to do with racism in some way. But the orchestra manager, rather than apologize, condescendingly explained to him that what he called the entire Negro problem was too big for the symphony to solve on its own, and essentially that he shouldn't complain about this change in seating. The Symphony Society agreed that henceforth black patrons would informally be given tickets in a separate section while, and I'm quoting from a document, avoiding in all instances use of the word segregated. So the minutes are an unambiguous record of institutional racism written and filed away by the racist institution itself. It's a very potent and disturbing primary source. And if you click on it, you get first a link to the relevant sort of library citations for the document. And then if you click on it again, you get the minutes themselves, and you can see that this is a glorious high-resolution scan that's very easy to read. You can magnify it if you want to. And I've paraphrased the story here, but you can see that it's signed by S.E. McMillan, the manager, and I forget who the chairman was, and I can't make out the signature from there, but I've got that information as well. So this is the format of the whole thing, is that there are these documents that you can then click on. And to sort of flesh out the story, I've added some pictures here. So this is the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra in 1922. It was the closest I could find in 1923 when the minutes were written. Here is the Odeon Theater at Grand and Finney, which is where, this is where the orchestra was playing in 1923. So you get a sense, it's not very big, right? And you get a sense of, this is the space that the symphony orchestra decided to segregate in this sort of unofficial way. But so this is, I hope, useful in getting a sense of the context. What was most interesting for me as a historian was figuring out who Mr. Burgess was. It's this tantalizing little clue because we don't get anything other than that, and the fact that his sister was a music teacher in the minutes. So what I've done is create a kind of detective story almost, where by clicking on the images, you can follow the trail that I followed. So I started off with something called the Polk Gould St. Louis Directory, which is kind of the what they used to call the white pages, right, where it's personal telephone numbers and addresses for 1923. And if you click on this, I think I can magnify it to So if you scroll down here, these are the Burgesses, and you can see people's professions are given. This person's a porter, that's a telephone operator, that's an assistant secretary treasurer or something. The only music teacher is a woman named Myrtle A. Burgess. So I thought to myself, well, maybe this is Mr. Burgess's sister. And then if you look at the addresses, let's see, do I need to go down? One of the most prominent Burgesses in boldface is a lawyer and notary public named Albert Burgess, who lives at the same address as Myrtle. So this was interesting. I wanted to make sure, one of the few things I knew is that Myrtle would have been African American, so I clicked on something called the St. Louis Negro, or I looked through something called the St. Louis Negro Business and Trade Directory from a little bit later, and this confirms, right there near the bottom, that Myrtle A. Burgess was a music teacher. Now she's at a different address, but her inclusion in this directory indicates that she was African American, so it's more evidence that this might have been the person we're talking about. And if you do a little more research on Albert Burgess, who's the person whose name was so sort of conspicuously highlighted, probably because he had to pay extra to have his name boldface in the directory, it turns out he was a pretty fascinating person. So he was the first African-American attorney licensed to practice in St. Louis, and this was in 1877. And from 1894 to 1902, Albert Burgess was the assistant city attorney of the city of St. Louis, which made him the highest-ranking black office holder in the history of St. Louis up to this point. And this profile in the St. Louis Globe-Democrat that celebrates his 50th year of practice tells us that he was Myrtle's father, and he also had two sons, Elmer, who became the director of physical education for black schools in Baltimore, and Wilmont, who became a school principal in St. Louis itself. So all three of Albert's children were educators, and the brother who went to the symphony office to protest the segregated seating was either Elmer or Wilmot. I don't know which one because the leads kind of go cold at that point. So this is one of these pages, and I'm sort of talking you through the narrative and the kinds of sources you can pull up. And I think there are two big things that I hope students can learn from this. One is they can learn some things about segregation itself. So one point to be made that I wish didn't have to be made, but that often does, is that segregation was real. This was not something where it was sort of ambiguous or, well, perhaps people just didn't mix or something like that. We have a document that says we are not going to seat people in the same sections of a theater, right? So if you were trying to persuade students of this truth, it's there. And segregation did not have to involve new laws. It did not have to involve famous Supreme Court cases. It was often woven into the fabric of everyday life. So in a matter of minutes at the end of a closed-door meeting, the Symphony Society established an unspoken policy of seating African Americans in their own section. We can also learn that segregation affected African Americans regardless of social class or formal education. So the Burgesses were one of the most accomplished families of any ethnicity in St. Louis. I think that's a reasonable thing to say. But the white orchestra manager didn't even know who they were, right? He refers to them as a Mr. Burgess. You know, it's like you describe somebody you've never met before or heard of before. So the economic status, the degree of involvement in the community, their professionalism and so on did not entitle them to fair treatment at the Symphony Orchestra in 1923. So these are lessons we can learn about the history of segregation. What I've tried to do with the way I've told the story is also teach something about what historians do. So where did this story come from? What kinds of evidence do we need to tell it or even know about it? You know, I've shown some of these here. How do historians piece together that evidence to create a narrative? What broader context is required to interpret a narrative as part of a larger history? And I should add that each page starts by addressing a different kind of source. So this one starts with the minutes of a board meeting. There's another story where I start with business correspondence, another where I start with the records of the Urban League, another where I start with old newspapers, and then a final one, the one on Washington University, starts with a scrapbook, actually, which is one of the more compelling kinds of sources. So it shows, at some level, what historians actually do to piece together the stories that we're told about our past. And I think I will turn things over to Connor at this point.
Oh, sure.
And we can have some Q&A later if you like. Thank you.
100%. Yeah, and so what got me thinking again, I'll give you a personal story just about discussing race in the classroom. Like, I just want to give a brief overview. I'll give you one or two from the Divided City platform that, like, I'll discuss briefly. I want to give you guys enough time. But last Friday, I was in my History St. Louis class. They were supposed to be reviewing for their second unit. We're talking about French colonial history in St. Louis. I gave them note cards. They were diving in, you know, reviewing, and a girl, a female student, just like kind of shouts last like 5 minutes of class. She says, "Oh, by the way, the Stockley decision came out." And I was like, I wanted you to be reviewing, but okay, you're on your phone. Okay, I don't know. And so now I got to stop class and I have to like kind of brace myself for like what she's thinking and what I need to like frame myself around how I'm going to discuss this decision. I know as much as I can, but I think what happened is I tried to close class, make sure to tell them there was a test tomorrow and talk about the race decision all in about 5 minutes. And I might have said words like, please be safe. Don't drink this weekend. Like, I don't know what I was saying. So in my head, I didn't frame it the best. And I was like, I always can do better about that stuff. So for me, here's just a few things that's like good guidelines that like, if I were to do that a second time, I would have made sure that I would have thought about and looked at. One is to definitely think about whenever these decisions come out, whenever you have like an opportunity to talk to students about this, but specifically race, make sure you set those clear guidelines right away in the class. Always a good teaching, you need to do this regardless, but if you can do that, then you'll be setting yourself up for success. One thing that like I've looked at, and this is like kind of earlier pedagogy thought this is a better idea, to make sure that you are colorblind in the class. You never want to just be thinking about, you know, I'm going to try to be as safe as I can, and all students, I'm going to make sure that I'm treating them as equal as possible. Yeah, you do, but you got to respect the students' cultures and backgrounds and unique experiences they're bringing in, and you don't want to just think that all students are the exact same that are going to be in your class. One thing that also popped up was racial talk. versus racist talk in the class. Sometimes students has never had this opportunity before to like actually come in and think about race throughout history and have those conversations. And if you don't let them kind of fail a little bit or stumble, it becomes then a complete roadblock for them. Sometimes we set it up as an all or nothing type of situation. But if I'm talking about the history of St. Louis and I'm saying, hey, there was white flight, hey, there were private covenants that happened in St. Louis, that's not racist talk. That's more racial. I'm just kind of bringing about these trends that happened in St. Louis, and we got to know more about them. We got to be able to understand them a lot better. And then also be in tune with individual bias. At Clayton High School, we are doing a lot of equity talk at the high school, and one of the things that our presenter said was like, you cannot do that. You can't just check your bias at the door and then come in thinking that you're in good shape, because nobody can do that. We always have some bias. We always have some perspective that we're bringing in. And students have to know that. Students have to be able to understand that, like, I can't be a blank slate and I can't like always play devil's advocate. I've got to make sure that they know that I'm bringing that in, and so are they too. And it's an important thing to appreciate what they're coming into the conversation with. And the final point that I think is really important, and I'll get into that specifically, is if we can iron out these conversational differences, or if we can just talk about race in the classroom, then hopefully that helps students feel more comfortable with it, and they can tackle big, broad, systematic issues that we can see. So again, those are just some brief ones to talk about. I'm going to skip this real quick, and I'm going to go straight into what the Divided City platform has for you as an educator, and you'll be able to look at it in just a sec. One is a platform called Mapping Decline in our city. St. Louis is a place where the urban landscape is not different among other Midwestern cities like Detroit and Cincinnati, Ohio, where we were very much doing a lot of good industry all throughout. And then about 1950, we were the fourth largest city in the United States, and then we started to have a lot of urban decline. And so this is a really cool project that's there that I think could be helpful. What this researcher did at WashU is pick 9 different neighborhoods. And if you're unfamiliar with St. Louis City, they're neighborhoods. And then outside of that, we got the county, and we've got about 90 or so county small municipalities. But here in the city of St. Louis, they picked 9 different neighborhoods, and they went statistically into so many different things. It's a little blurry up there, but you've got population, gender, race, economy. And so you can spread these out for the students and think of what are some trends that you see, what are some similarities, what are some differences. And one that made sense to me, or I pulled out, is in the Central West End. You have an extremely pretty affluent society, affluent like area that they're living. 54% white, 26% black, and then you go literally just a little north, literally just a little bit west into the West End, and that number flips completely. Now you have 72% black. You have only 1% white. So to pose the question to students, why? Why is that the case? And that is an extremely hard question to answer. You have to then really dive in. Another thing that might ring true for you is Ferguson and what happened in 2014. On this website, they have an oral history, a big archive, kind of like what Dr. Burke was doing with music segregation. This one specifically is for Ferguson. It gives anything from poems, photography, anything that's on there they have that's specifically related to Ferguson, and you can research that in just a minute. This one, segregation isn't just, black and white, that kind of issue, but this is one that's going to be coming out in October 11th on LGBTQ, where that community was spending a lot of their time throughout St. Louis history. There's going to be a grand opening at the Missouri History Museum for it, but I don't think the platform necessarily, you can interact with it too much online. Maybe see if it's a little different. Bless you. And then the final one that I wanted to show you real quick is this. It's called Visualizing Urban History. Again, it might not be able to interact the best, but for me, what it was interesting is to see is all of these different places in St. Louis that have had either housing covenants or what they called like slum clearing or like urban renewal projects that in all reality were just a way to push African Americans from one place out to another. So you can look through those and see what you can find. But if you could, and I always ask my students this, I have freshmen, sometimes they're ornery, they're hard to work with, but just give me 15 or 20 minutes and like look through some of this stuff and tag with a partner if you don't have a computer. And just, I want you to think about that question that I wrote on the bottom. Just what aspects of this platform, Divided City, do you see that you could use in your classroom or give some direction for students who are having, a difficult time thinking about what happened over the weekend or another event that would pop up? What about this Divided City project could you use in your own classroom? So I just wanted to see 15 minutes or so, and if you've got a computer, you can tag with somebody, and then we'll come back and we'll brainstorm and kind of share out.
And just a quick comment from me, the Music and Segregation site is not available in a sort of specifically mobile device format yet, so it works well on some and not on others. If you're having trouble getting it to work on your phone or your iPad, we're not using this for the next few minutes, are we?
Yeah,
so
no.
If anybody wants to come up and use the laptop that's plugged in here, that might be a way to do it as well. So see if it works. My ancient iPhone 5 does not handle it very well, but you might have something better than that.
So Divided City is your thesis that you did, your research and everything?
Divided City is an entire project that it's a big project that consists of several sort of sub-projects.
Okay.
So the Music and Segregation project was my individual project within that umbrella, but then the other ones Connor is talking about were done by seperate groups of researchers.
So you guys have hooked up through this Divided City project?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. I've actually never heard of it.
Yep.
The first one that you did, that's this neighborhood.
Yeah. So they've got about I'll turn this off because it'd be. I might make an executive decision maybe. Do we want to discuss like now-ish, and then, maybe it might end 10 minutes later or 10 minutes early or something like that? Maybe we can try that, so I think we have enough time to look through it. But does anybody have any like thoughts to bring to the table? I mean, I don't have to write everything you say, but I heard some good things as I was just walking around. But is there anything that you caught your attention when you were looking through it, or something that you researched more into?
I want to get down there. I thought that the detective, who is Mr. Burke's question, mapped very, very nicely onto Sarah J. Brown's description of a trace of primary source. I don't remember a source of significance, and then students can, you can provide the support for students to provide an interpretation and ultimately a narrative.
Right. Yeah, no, 100%. Sometimes the journey is just as much as kind of the end, but I think scaffolding that to be like, hey, there's 5 images and they are totally related. It is a story that you might not know about in St. Louis, and all of a sudden it gets kids interested. And it's about something we're talking about when it comes to segregation, yeah, that can be really cool to bring it all together. And it relates totally to what she's talking about with that little trace of a historical narrative and then developing the whole thing. That's really true. Yeah, please. Yeah, hey, sure. Or anything that you like. Yeah.
Well, my grandfather was a graduate of Sumner High School, and he would explain to me about times when there was this really famous steakhouse downtown that he couldn't, eat at. And I was like, well, how could that be? And how you could use this in the classroom is one, have the students do oral histories. Find the oldest or the eldest member of your family and have those real conversations, because this is also the year of the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and they'll be celebrating it. And for them to truly understand, they have to understand how at first you could not, if that act hadn't passed, you wouldn't be able to go to the Fox or a lot of the places that you're able to go to so freely now. And so in order to bring it to the classroom, you would have to have these type of articles,
right?
Because one specifically, my brother graduated from St. Louis University High School, and just reading that St. Louis U graduates, that's where the graduation is held at the Symphony Hall, and I wouldn't have known that. But just knowing that, you're like, but that's where they graduate from, and just being able to tie those things together is neat for them to actually see that they are able to see history come alive.
And it gives you a whole new perspective about St. Louis that like you really had no idea. You're like, where was this kind of whole story that was like there, but I didn't know about it? And sometimes like history's 2020, especially with high school students, they're like, whatever, history, it has no connection to me. And then later on in life, they're like, whoa, it totally does. One thing just so you know that I've done in History of St. Louis is like almost at the very start of the year, I always do their oral history projects, but it's for St. Louis specifically. So I try to say, give me that one person that is like goes as far back as you can that came to St. Louis. Like who's the first person that like you could talk to or you can remember or finding through your archives that like has a connection to St. Louis. And sometimes it's them, sometimes it's a grandparent, a great grandparent, and then hearing their stories about their connection, it is so cool. And for me, it builds a lot of just respect for them because I know the background that they're coming into with this class. And they always tell me something about St. Louis I had no idea about. So it is really cool. No, that's awesome. Yeah.
I think just like leading off that is Cynthia inadvertently left us a document. And so when you think about the power and the fact that they created that document, that the oral histories that weren't recorded, and the important fact that what is missing from this fact that high school is very interesting people in St. Louis because as documented in the event in the meeting to show the context of the tradition, the context of what was going on. And I think the oral history piece, we were talking about voice of witness and the importance of those oral histories to show all of those different perspectives and sides that might not be canonized in the legal documents left, behind.
Yeah, or they're just gathering dust in the archives like you've been finding.
Yeah, and I think it also shows how sort of contingent our understanding of history. Yeah, like if they, part of me wonders like, why would you file this? I mean, you've come up with this system that even in 1923, they know it's going to be bad PR, right? That's why they say don't tell anyone about it. But they're so official, but they still file the document, right? But had they crumpled it up and thrown it away, that story's gone. That's the only it's the only record of that conversation that I'm aware of. There may be somebody may have written a letter to their friend about it or something, but I don't know where that is. So it's, who knows what stories we don't know? I mean, exactly what you're saying, I think.
Yeah, please.
But I think in connection to that, I think it's interesting. It took the orchestra to 1923 to decide to segregate. In 1922, Mrs. Burke just attended the orchestra on an unsegregated basis. They segregated because of customer complaint. I don't know when the orchestra began. I'm going to take a guess sometime after the Civil War.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's say it's even 1900. So for 22 years, they didn't have any policy regarding segregation. Then a few customers complained, and then in 1923, they decided to have a de facto segregation program.
That might be right. I guess the one thing I would wonder is, I don't know that we can necessarily extrapolate it back to the very beginnings of the orchestra. I mean, it's possible that other kinds of segregation, it's possible that, St. Louis city laws took care of the problem before this. That's something we can find out, certainly, but it may be, and bear in mind, the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra are actually fairly liberal. It's a fairly liberal institution by the standards of 1923. So, yeah, my hunch is that they decided to kind of try the experiment and see if perhaps, if integration could work. Again, without saying anything official about it. And then when it turns out that they got complaints, they backed down, again, without saying anything official about it. So it's very unclear to me what the policy was before then, if there was one at all. But it's a great point.
Oh yeah, go for it.
I noticed on the page you pulled, I was reading yours because my phone's not giving me all the links and everything. There was a quote in one of the articles about after the concert in the park that this is like been the best thing to draw St. Louis together or something along that lines. So I'm thinking that would be a great opening for the timeline of events in St. Louis. So if that was like bringing blacks and whites together, then what happened since then? After that.
Definitely.
Looking at events.
No, that's a really good point. Just to grab students' attention and then kind of take that step back approach and say, okay, what's gone on since then? And yeah, it's true. Yeah, Burke, you had something.
Oh, then just the comment about the orchestra, and that made me think of when the NFL was integrated and then became segregated and then reintegrated later. And its earliest was not segregated.
Oh, I see. When was this around the same time as that? Okay, yeah.
Like this narrative of integration as
I'll check that out. Yeah, I didn't know about that.
action is not really true.
Right.
Look at people making decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just something from an earlier breakout session with anti-imperialists in history. You think they're on the cutting edge of being extremely liberal. And they're not, they've got that whole framework, but some of them still had the framework of the time, which was, how they viewed hierarchy was still kind of in line with what an imperialist might view. So that's a good point. Anybody else just from the Divided City website or anything else to contribute? What?
I was just kind of reflecting on the whole question that Sarah Brennan kind of came up with at first was how do your students experience history, and maybe kids don't realize that the current events of the time are going to someday be history. So I think the Divided City of what they're trying to attempt is to kind of put things out there for what might soon be reflected on in so many years by researchers later. And so they're trying to maybe get ahead of that. So maybe when the kids look at, they might have never thought about LGBTQ segregation. They might not have really thought about Ferguson as a big platform that the U.S. has sprung off of and things like that. So I think the kids realizing that they do experience history every day and that it will stay around for a very long time. The documents from 1923 are around still, and we can zoom in on them now. There's going to be so many more documents in the future from now. So just kind of having them realize that is pretty important.
A lot of tweets coming out, that's for sure. But, and I think finally, and I forgot your name in the back with the pig, you teach at Lindbergh. Rachel made a good point just to kind of say as well, St. Louis is a microcosm of what's happening in the United States at this time. Like St. Louis experiences all the things that the United States has too. So Claire's point of like maybe thinking about this stuff and about history and maybe how am I going to jump in for students, give them that local approach, give them that local perspective, that local flavor, that they're like, whoa, this happened, these housing covenants that like restricted African Americans from living in a certain section, that happened 10 miles from me. It's like, I can't imagine like how, and then just to kind of put that in their lap. And for me, just working with Dr. Burke on this a little bit, the time I've had with him, I know I'm changing the way that I'm going to teach after post-war history of St. Louis. I am definitely going to look more into how these have had effects and rather just kind of go and skim the surface. I'd rather take 3-4 days and afford that time for students to dive into a subject like housing covenants or like something in music and how it's segregated, the symphony or the muni. I'd rather take that time because I think it would have more exploratory learning for them. So that's the way that I look at it. But is there any other thoughts for the greater whole? Okay.
Say that, like, I think one of the powerful things about this is I teach U.S. history to juniors, and like, yes, they might be able to spit out the textbook examples of X, Y, or Z, but to be able to say, like, we're going to look at the Great Migration through the eyes of, different perspectives coming to St. Louis from one of the sessions yesterday, or we're going to, look at the impacts of white flight and then, like, housing and crude IGO, which there was some good resources in here about that, and that documentary is awesome. Like, to give them, I just think that's so much richer of an experience, and to take those, like, quote unquote right answers of what this was and to like bring it alive in a way that, resources aren't.
Yeah, don't forget St. Louis for sure. Cool. Dr. Burke, any final thoughts that you want to say? Or?
No, not really, other than thank you all very much for coming and listening to this. I really do hope this is useful to you. As usual, I have forgotten to bring any business cards with me, but I'm very easy to find. My name is Patrick Burke, and if you go to music.wustl.edu, you can find my page and my email address. If there's anything I can do to help, please don't be shy to drop me a line. So, thank you.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, there's all that information too. Yeah, so thanks so much. We appreciate it. Yeah.